Okay, so we're going to move ahead now to a different topic altogether. We all know that there are a lot of sanctions issues going on in the world, sanctions from various places, the US government, the EU, various other places. And the session now is actually, what are those regulations and are they working? Our first presentation is by Bruce Paulsen, who's partner at Seward and Kissel. Bruce has come across from the US, thank you very much. And the title of the presentation is The US Government Zeroes in on Shipping. Bruce, please.
Thank you, Kevin. Hopefully everybody will filter back from the coffee break. Good morning. 2023 was a very busy year on the sanctions front. I am going to go, as I have done before, over this subject matter with breakneck speed. I will also try to set the table for the next panel that's going to get into some of these issues in more detail. So I'm going to start with what we'll cover. We're going to talk about sanctions in the shipping industry. We're not going to talk too much about some of the ancillary industries. Obviously, sanctions focus to a large extent on financial services. We're going to have a particular focus on the oil price cap policy. We're going to talk about the intensifying U.S. enforcement environment. The U.S. is increasing its scrutiny of shipping, and this is a years-long trend. We're going to talk about compliance, because compliance is your first line of defense when avoiding trouble in the sanctions space, and it's also your first line of defense when it comes to the time where perhaps you get in trouble. I'm going to spend 2 minutes on the basics while people are finishing up their coffee. There are 38 U.S. sanctions programs. They vary widely in size and range and targeting. But if you can remember three things, you can understand how the U.S. sanctions laws work. And those three things are primary sanctions, secondary sanctions, and sectoral sanctions. With primary sanctions, think Iran, Cuba, think 1979, 1962. Actually, they go back to the beginning of the Republic. Primary sanctions is a retronym. These just used to be sanctions. U.S. persons can't do business with certain what it considers to be malign regimes. In addition, U.S. persons cannot do business with specially designated nationals, whether they're maintained on OFAC's specially designated nationals and blocked persons list. So these are primary sanctions. U.S. persons banned from doing business with certain people, certain entities, certain countries. Secondary sanctions go back to 1996 with Iran and Libya as an attempt by Congress to legislate extraterritorially and focus on non-U.S. persons doing business with sanctioned regimes. And these sanctions are managed by OFAC, which has power over the U.S. dollar, which it allows it to sanction foreign entities. Finally, sectoral sanctions. 2014, the incursion by Russia into Crimea. Certain sectors of the Russian economy were targeted. There you don't have an SDN list, you have an SSI list. Okay, so who must comply? With primary sanctions, think U.S. persons. U.S. persons includes any United States citizen, lawful permanent resident, entities organized under the laws of the United States. And here's a trap for the unwary, any person in the United States. So if you're from here and you're in the U.S. doing business on your iPhone with Iran, you have a sanctions problem. Non-U.S. persons owned or controlled by U.S. persons for certain regimes, Iran and Cuba primarily, are subject to sanctions. There is also a 50% rule. If you are a U.S. person and you're doing business with an entity that is not an SDN but is owned 50% or more in the aggregate by SDNs, you are doing business with an SDN. OFAC has a very broad view of its own jurisdiction, including any transactions that transit the U.S. financial system. In addition, non-U.S. persons, even if they have no contact whatsoever with the United States, face designation risk. We're going to see a little bit of this later with the oil price cap. If you are designated an SDN, even though you have no contact with the United States, it is a devastating sanction. In addition, OFAC's stock and trade is ambiguity. And so you have, for instance, in connection with designated foreign terrorist organizations, if you provide them with, quote, material support, you can be sanctioned. If you engage in significant transactions with particular regimes or entities, you can be sanctioned. These are very vague terms, and that vagueness keeps people on their toes, and the government knows it. There is also licensing. Certain cargoes, like food and humanitarian aid, can be shipped to places like Iran. And if there's a entity that's sanctioned, this happened a lot with Russia in 2022, the government will provide a general license to allow a wind-down period so people can stop doing business with those entities. Specific licenses are licenses to do something in a specific circumstance. You can apply in writing to OFAC to get a specific license. It has to be a prohibited activity in order to be able to do it. If you, for instance, find one morning that you have Iranian oil aboard your tanker, you may need to get a license to insure that vessel, to maintain it, to dry dock it, to bring it alongside somewhere to discharge the cargo. So specific licenses can be obtained in specific situations. Okay, 2022 and the invasion of Ukraine began the recent onslaught of Russia sanctions, which I talked about at length 2 years ago, and they continue. 1 year after the imposition of the first Russian sanctions by February of last year, OFAC had added over 2,500 Russian entities and other targets to the SDN list, including 2,400 entities and individuals, 115 vessels, and 19 aircraft. Over 80% of Russia's banking sector by assets is under U.S. sanctions, including the top 10 Russian banks. And sectoral sanctions have been imposed on many Russian business sectors. But we're going to talk mostly about, and the next panel is going to focus on the oil price cap. The oil price cap, which came around in the fall of 2022, had twin goals: to keep the market well supplied, but also reduce Russia's revenue per barrel. One of those goals, the oil is flowing, has succeeded. The other one, not so much. And we'll see more of that from the next panel. The oil price cap, which is the G7 policy, is structured as a prohibition on certain covered services: trading in commodities, broking, financing, shipping, insurance, reinsurance, P&I, flag states, and customs brokerage, for example. And U.S. persons are authorized to provide covered services only if the oil or petroleum products are purchased at or below the price cap. And this is based on a record-keeping and attestation process. There is a 5-year record-keeping requirement, and the government, under its regulations, has 3 tiers of actors based on the level of knowledge they have of the underlying sales transaction. Tier 1 actors are those with direct access to price information about the oil or products, traders, for instance. Tier 2 are those who sometimes have price information. So I went the wrong way on the slide there. Sometimes have access to price information. Tier 3 actors are where most of the people in shipping land, those who don't regularly have access to price information, including ship owners, P&I, and flags, for instance. And the ship owners must obtain customer attestations that attest that the sales price of the oil was below the cap so that they can lift those cargoes. The cap applies from embarkment of transport to the first landed sale outside of Russia. Once the oil is ashore, it can be sold above the cap. But the cap applies again if it is taken back to sea without first being, quote, substantially transformed. And substantially transformed does not mean blended. All right, the rise of the dark fleet. All of these rules that the G7 and the United States have propounded are very nice, but there is an enormous amount of evasion of the oil price cap, and it began before the price cap was even imposed. The U.S. is aware, and its first warning of, quote, possible evasion was in April of 2023 in connection with the ESPO pipeline and the port of Cosmino. The U.S. coalition service providers, the government said, had been providing services, covered services, above the cap in connection with those ports. Recent estimates of the number of vessels in the gray fleet, or the dark fleet, or the shadow fleet, whatever you want to call it, vary from approximately 800 to 1,600 vessels. U.S. guidance has indicated that you need to look, as those in the shipping business, at the red flags for sanctions evasion. Those include AIS spoofing, AIS spoofing and manipulation, STS transfers. Now, the government recognizes that ship-to-ship transfers happen every day, but where do they happen and when do they happen? A failure in attestations to itemize costs. If you have a CIF contract, you know, what's the cost, what's the insurance, what's the freight? Opaque management, aging fleet, sketchy insurance companies, these are all red flags for dark fleet issues, and I'm going to talk a little bit about Hennessy as we get towards the end. There has been a great deal of activity on the price cap front. We had the April alert from the government that I told you about. On October 12th, the Price Cap Coalition issued an advisory for the maritime oil industry in order to promote responsible practices in discussion of the shadow fleet. Look out for older fleet, poor flag states, falsified registration documents, unproven insurers. You need to know your ship if you're engaging in transporting Russian oil anywhere in the world. The same day, sanctions were imposed on 2 vessels, the first 2, and the registered owner, the Primoria and the Yasa Golden Bosphorus. In November, mid-November, Treasury sanctioned 3 additional vessels. On December 1st, another 3 were sanctioned, including the HS Atlantica, which was a Hennessy vessel. On December 20th, and I'm going to get into this in a little bit of detail, OFAC issued revised price cap guidance, tightening compliance obligations for all of you in this room in order to stay in the safe harbor. And then just last week, OFAC sanctioned Hennessy Holdings Limited, a UAE operation, and its entire fleet of 18 vessels. Okay, in mid-December, late December, right before Christmas, OFAC issued guidance saying that itemized ancillary cost information is going to be important if you're going to be in the safe harbor. To be afforded the safe harbor, actors with direct price access, that's Tier 1 actors, must maintain and retain evidence of compliance with the price cap, including itemized costs. Per voyage attestations for Tiers 2 and 3, which certainly includes everybody in the shipping business, each time a vessel lifts or loads Russian oil or Russian petroleum products, you need to get a new attestation. If you're the ship owner, you need to get that attestation before you lift the cargo. Others in the Tier 2, Tier 3 actor category can get the attestations within 30 days. In addition, Tier 3 actors, including ship owners, carriers, insurers, P&I clubs, and flagging registries, may be required to request additional information if they become suspicious or if they receive information about a suspected violation. So the idea that you can get a 1-sentence attestation and rely on it if you have some red flags within your knowledge, but the operation is not necessarily above board, you cannot be willfully blind. Okay, Hennessy, this was last week's big news. January 18th, OFAC announced sanctions against an UAE-based Emirates, UAE-based shipping company, Hennessy Holdings, makes you want to have a cognac, and its fleet of 18 vessels. OFAC determined that this fleet was formed in advance of the imposition of the oil price cap. So Hennessy went around and acquired a fleet of 18 old tankers that are repeatedly called in Russian Federation ports. The vessels and the parent entity are now designated as SDNs, Sanctions laws are designed to have devastating effects on the parties that are sanctioned. The greatest sanction that the U.S. can impose is designation as an SDN. These Hennessy ships are now toxic. They're not going to be able to get insured. They're not going to be able to call in a port. They're not going to be able to get financing. So Hennessy is for all intents and purposes, done. U.S. persons in possession of any Hennessy property have an obligation to block that property, that is, freeze that property, and within 10 business days, report that to OFAC. So if any of you out there have U.S. bank accounts with Hennessy money in them, you need to block that if you're a U.S. person and report to OFAC. Okay, to change the topic briefly from Russia, let's talk a little bit about Iran. Iran never goes away, and if anything, has become more intensely scrutinized in recent years. If you're looking for some good bedtime reading, I suggest you pull up the unsealed file, including the various different documents that were created by the United States government in connection with the Suez Rajan, including the seizure warrant and the plea agreement, all of which are unsealed. The Suez Rajan was a bareboat chartered vessel operated by Empire Navigation in Greece, which in February of 22 discovered it had Iranian oil aboard. It was contacted by the United States government, and there was a press release issued by an entity called United Against Nuclear Iran, which is a NGO which monitors smuggled oil and does a naming and shaming process where it issues a press release saying, you have oil aboard your ship, here are the satellite images, you need to do something about it. The ship spent about a year doing lazy circles off Singapore before traveling to Houston, where it anchored awaiting lighterage. The lightering entities did not want to offload the cargo, so it sat for months. The reasons they didn't want to offload the cargo was concern about retaliation from Iran. Ultimately, in September 2023, the first ever criminal resolution against a bareboat charterer was entered with a plea agreement against Empire Navigation. Ultimately, the oil was offloaded and sold and is subject to a U.S. government forfeiture proceeding in Houston. And Empire and Suez Rajan were assessed a fine of $2.45 million. And the big news here is 2 weeks ago on January 11th, the Suez Rajan, renamed St. Nicholas and still operated by Empire, was hijacked by the Iranian Navy. All right, a little bit about compliance. On May 14th in 2020, and I refer all of you to go to the OFAC website, which is a very user-friendly website, and OFAC is a pretty user-friendly federal agency. OFAC, together with the State Department and the Coast Guard, compiled all of its prior guidance to the maritime industry. And so it's all there in one place. It's a very good document to have in front of you. It hits all the red flags: AIS manipulation, alteration of vessel identification, falsified cargo or vessel documents, know your bills of lading, STS transfers, flag hopping, and everything, all referenced in this May 2020 guidance. But more currently, in December of 2023, 5 federal agencies in what's called a Quint Seal compliance note, the Department of Commerce, the Department of State, Department of Justice, Treasury, and Homeland Security, issued further guidance for ship owners and those in the shipping industry about sanctions. It reiterated the red flags that were in the May 2020 note. It recommended compliance practices, that you know your cargo. KYC is extremely important in the shipping business. Any kind of cross-border business OFAC has its eyes on in any event, but it is focused and zeroing in, as the title of this talk is about, on shipping. You need to conduct supply chain due diligence, and information sharing among the industry is recommended. All right, we're getting to the finish line here. OFAC enforcement guidelines. OFAC has a number of considerations that it takes into account when it comes time to enforce. Those are in the right-hand column on this slide. The first is, did you come to OFAC voluntarily? Again, OFAC has its eyes on these transactions. If you're doing a ship-to-ship transfer and you get that letter from United Against Nuclear Iran saying that your ship has sanctioned cargo aboard, OFAC already knows. But in other situations, maybe the government doesn't have knowledge. You get an automatic 50% mitigation of penalty if you were the first in to the agency. Now, that's not to say that in every situation you need to disclose, but it's something to take very seriously. OFAC looks at whether the violation was willful or reckless. Did you cooperate with the agency? Have you harmed the sanction program objectives? And this will determine what the penalty ultimately will be, and these penalties can be severe. Of course, in certain situations, there's no action. Maybe you're the innocent lender, innocent owner. You didn't know this was happening. You did all your due diligence. You did your KYC, and you ended up with the cargo aboard your ship in any event. So maybe no action is the result. Maybe you get a cautionary letter. Don't do that again. That's what OFAC does. You may have a finding of a violation, or in the case of the Suez Rajan, a criminal referral to the Department of Justice resulting in a plea agreement. That is serious punishment. Okay. One last document that you ought to have in front of you at all times, and that is the 2019 OFAC Framework for Compliance. And this, I'll just read from it. If you're in this business, you need to employ a risk-based approach to sanctions compliance by developing, implementing, and routinely updating a sanctions compliance program that they call an SCP. While each risk-based SCP will vary depending on a variety of factors, including the company's size and sophistication. What we hear in shipping a lot of the time is, we're not big enough, we're a small operation, we only have a handful of ships, we don't have enough personnel to run the kind of compliance program that OFAC wants. Well, you need to have a compliance program that fits your size and sophistication. And that program must have 5 essential components, which includes management commitment, tone from the top, risk assessment, internal controls, testing and auditing, and training. The program has to be real, it has to be lived, and it has to be supported by senior management. It is indeed the first line of defense when the U.S. government comes knocking at your door. We don't have time for questions, but I'm around all day and I'm happy to answer them. Thank you.